If anyone in the Apothecary Diaries had the right to become a villain, it was Loulan. She was neglected, a political puppet, and forced to witness the darker side of a broken family system. And yet, she became one of the most selfless people in the series. Meanwhile, Shenmei, who suffered far less, became a monster. Why is that? Why did one woman let pain consume her, while the other refused to let it become her identity? The answer has less to do with what happened to them, and more to do with the stories they told themselves about it. On the surface, Loulan seems like nothing more than a haughty princess with eccentric fashion choices and an off-putting personality. And in that light, she seems like the copy of her mother, both in the present and in decades before. Beneath all their makeup, they were wounded women suffering differently. And nowhere is that difference clearer than in how each woman viewed the exact same role. Both Loulan and Shenmei were consorts to 2 generations of emperors, and they were both political pawns at that. What was different about them was their feelings about being consorts. Loulan would have rather died than bring forth the emperor's heir, partially because she didn't want to be a political puppet, but also because she didn't want to tie her worth to her title or her position. Shenmei, on the other hand, wanted to be in the rear palace. She wanted to become the most powerful woman in the nation by bringing forth an heir for the emperor. She had tied her hopes and even her value to the possibility of it happening. So when it didn't, she interpreted it as being denied the throne. To her, that humiliation was equivalent to being stripped of dignity and even as violation. Loulan was neglected by her mother. Shenmei didn't really pay attention to her unless she was being her dress-up doll and puppet. So much so that when Loulan wasn't wearing any makeup, Shenmei didn't recognize her. Loulan first had her moment of shock when her mother struck her because she didn't recognize her when she was wearing a maid's uniform. And in a later narration to Mao Mao, she confesses that her mother had once poured boiling water on her. In other words, she was stripped of her identity. She had to mimic her mother to survive and put on heavy makeup to be recognized. Shenmei had a tragic past and a gradual descent into villainy. I have a whole video where I dive into that, and I'll link it in the cards and in the description below. That said, she was also a victim of her own delusion. She seemed to recall things with an intensity that just wasn't real, and a part of it stems from her narcissism. Shenmei was loved, but just not in the way she wanted to be loved. The man she wanted feared adult women. The man that wanted her more than anything was beneath her, at least by her own estimation. And in the end, she ended up with Shisho. Now when you hear her backstory, you'd expect her to be resentful, and that's understandable because she was hurt. But she was much more than that. Essentially, in her own mind, she was the most wronged woman in history. She magnified her disappointment and pain to a point where she created an illusion of having suffered more than she actually did. This perspective greatly influenced how she dealt with her emotional pain. Loulan didn't have the luxury of standing up to her mother. That is why, to cope, she learned to smile at the things that made her mother smile, be angry at the things that made her angry, and be neutral when she was cruel. Now that may not seem like a huge deal, like she was simply mimicking facial expressions, but it was much deeper than that. Shenmei's actions constantly make you want to flinch or look away. And Loulan always had to watch with a straight face, even when it was Suirei that was the victim of Shenmei's cruelty. And yet somehow, Loulan didn't become like her mother, but we'll get back to that in a bit. Remember how I said that Shenmei was a victim of her own delusion? Well, her actions followed suit. Shenmei abused everyone. If they were a living human being, she reveled in their pain. From her husband to her stepdaughter to Loulan to the rest of the Shi clan. And still that wasn't enough. She wanted the entire empire of Li to feel her pain and wrath. When I looked at some of the victims of the previous emperor like Anshi, Shenlu and Taiho, we saw their rage and also saw how they took their revenge. Their actions were limited to just a few people. But for Shenmei, there was no real God. It was all blind rage. That was how she coped with her pain. So why did Shenmei hurt people? The simple answer is that hurt people hurt people. Of course, this isn't always the case, as we see with Loulan. But Shenmei never grew past her pain, but rather embodied it and made sure all around her suffered her pain. Her lack of concern and her inhumane punishments all show that she was a horrible person. But I think the thing that really shows just how vile she was were her, let's call them parties. She specifically gathered married women, often mothers, to come to her depraved gatherings, humiliating them for her amusement. Now, the show doesn't make it clear whether these people were there by their own volition or not. Loulan's reaction in the end makes it seem like they were, but being that this is Shenmei we are talking about, I think they might have been forced into it. Now, I've always wondered why these parties of all things. I came up with 3 reasons. For starters, she was punishing Shisho. His room was literally next to where she held her parties. He could hear everything. It was a way for her to psychologically torture him and strip him more and more of his dignity, even in the eyes of his own people. Shenmei had once felt powerless in the rear palace, so she needed to make sure that Shisho felt that way too. Another reason was power. Shenmei had the deluded idea that she had been stripped of her dignity and debased beyond words, so her parties were her ultimate power move. She needed people to feel degraded too, and her sadistic side found pleasure in doing it to others. The fact that no one could oppose or refuse her whims made her feel powerful. And the third reason was that she was trying to desensitize Loulan. Shenmei was trying to turn Loulan into a mini version of her, so she had her present at these parties, witnessing everything, which, to be honest, is just so heartbreaking. Like, there's literally no way a loving mother would do that to their own daughter. And yet Shenmei did. She was rotting inside and needed her daughter to rot as well. And yet, despite all that she saw, Loulan chose to be different. I find Loulan's survival story so haunting, and I'm curious, do you think Loulan's masks were more of a cage for her than her mother's rage? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, back to Loulan. What amazes me about Loulan is that everything in her childhood should have pushed her towards becoming another Shenmei. She had learned to wear masks and to hide her emotions. She could see how power was in the hands of the cruel, and that kindness was often punished and integrity even cost people their lives. Loulan learned from the things she observed, and yet somehow she refused to be hardened. She still hoped. As a little girl, she kept hoping her mother would change. She wanted to find a way to protect her sister. She chose to shoulder the weight of the wrath of the Imperial Army. Beneath the acting and beneath the makeup, the disguises and the personas, Loulan managed to protect the most fragile thing she had, her humanity. Shenmei was not like that at all. When all her plans came crashing down, she was enraged, not for her wasted youth or for the loss of her husband, but that her daughter had challenged her belief. In her rage, she tried to end Loulan, but it all blew up in her face. The saddest part is that when we looked at her story initially, no one saw her as a laughingstock but as a victim. But her actions made her words and perception a reality. The Empire had never made a mockery of her, but now her actions made certain that it would. So why did Shenmei become a monster while Loulan became the person trying to save everyone? It wasn't their suffering that defined them, but the meaning they attached to their suffering. It was the stories they chose to tell themselves. For one, the story became a prison, and for the other, it became a lifeline. And somehow, the girl who had every reason to become cruel was the one who always stayed kind. The tragedy of Shenmei isn't that she suffered. It's that she spent years conjuring up evidence that the world had wronged her and convinced herself that her suffering was the most important thing about her. Loulan spent her years looking for reasons to protect as many as she could, and the beauty of her story isn't that she escaped suffering, it's that she never made it her identity. I love digging into character moments that are often overlooked. If you're taking a second look at the Apothecary Diaries or exploring it for the first time, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next deep dive. Can't wait till the next video? No worries. I have an entire playlist exploring several characters in the world of the Apothecary Diaries. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!